This podcast contains material of a violent and disturbing nature. It is not suited for all audiences.
Hi, and welcome to episode 12 of Horror Tales, a podcast in which you can sit back and listen to a scary story. My name is Max Ablitzer and I'm the producer of Horror Tales. Today's story, presented in an edited version, was written by David Peake and was first published in the anthology Twice Told, a collection of doubles. It is narrated by Joe Juvland, featuring Paul Fowles and Alison Latondres. The music and sound design are as always produced by myself. It is called The Final Diagnosis of Dr. Lazare.
At first, there was nothing, and only in his awareness of this nothingness did something emerge. There were two identical rooms, two sets of 4 white-tiled walls gleaming with light, suspended over a black void. He saw them as if from above, these two identical rooms, miniature glass cubes, and within each room he saw a bed and a chair facing the bed. He felt himself drifting toward the two rooms, worried at first that he might slip into the depthless space between them, becoming lost forever in the black void. Yet as he drew closer, still caught in the drift, the two rooms pulled together and became one, sharing the same light. He felt the warmth of the light on the backs of his hands and upon his face. Air filled his lungs. He opened his eyes. The man lay in a twin-sized bed, tucked tight beneath white sheets. Sunlight filled a wire-reinforced glass window. Nearby, an empty wooden chair faced him. The walls of the room were white tile, gleaming and sanitized. He heard a sound like the rattle of an alarm and saw a steam radiator in the corner, where before there had been nothing. A doorway appeared, and a man wearing a white lab coat and expensive pants walked through it. He sat in the wooden chair opposite the bed, crossed one leg over the other, and laid his clipboard against his thigh. Then he removed a retractable pen from the breast pocket of his lab coat, clicked it, and offered a sterile smile.
"Good morning,"
he said.
"I am Dr. Lazare."
"Where am I?" the man in the bed asked, surprised by the sound of his own voice, the way it rattled around inside his head, so tinny and alien. He cleared his throat.
"You're here with us,"
the doctor said, scribbling notes as he spoke. He paused a moment, then met the man's eyes.
"Before we continue, I need you to promise me that we won't have any more violent outbursts. Not like yesterday."
He smiled again.
"Can you promise me that?"
"Yesterday?" the man said.
"You don't remember,"
the doctor said. He seemed to consider this for a moment, then uncrossed his legs and stood. He wheeled close a metal table, which somehow the man had not previously noticed, and used the controls on the side of the bed to raise the man into a sitting position. Finally, he removed a ruled notepad and a yellow pencil from the side pocket of his lab coat and placed them on the table.
"I'd like to administer a test.
the doctor said.
Don't worry, there are no right or wrong answers. It's merely a method of measuring the progress of your recovery.
My recovery? The man said.
Your recovery,
the doctor repeated. He removed a sheet of paper from his clipboard and laid it on the table beside the notepad and the pencil. The paper contained 4 diagrams drawn with black lines.
Please take a moment to familiarize yourself with these diagrams. After a few moments, I will ask you to recreate them.
The man studied the diagrams. The first diagram showed a single square, and then below that, a set of 4 equal-sized squares, and then below that, a set of 9 equal-sized squares. The second diagram showed 4 sets of 2 overlapping circles. The interior of each circle was shaded differently, as were the overlapping regions. Dr. Lazare took away the sheet of paper that contained the diagrams.
Now,
He said,
please recreate what you saw using the pencil and the notepad. I'll leave you alone to concentrate. When I return, we will review your work and discuss the results.
He crossed the room and quietly closed the door behind him. The only sound in the room was the radiator rattling, which the man did his best to ignore. In doing so, the sound disappeared. He made to reach for the pencil and saw that his right arm had been handcuffed to the bed rail. The handcuffs were connected by a silver link chain, which afforded him extra range of motion, just enough to reach the pencil on the table. He looked to his other arm and saw that it was wrapped in pressure bandages. When he attempted to move the fingers on his left hand, he found that they did not respond. A plastic oxygen sensor was clamped over the tip of his left index finger. He traced the plastic tube from the sensor to a monitor on an extendable rolling pole. The monitor beeped at a regular rhythm, and a small green light on its face held constant. All of these things he accepted as truths, facts beyond manipulation. The man picked up the pencil in his good hand and started to recreate the diagrams as he remembered them. When he was done, he set the pencil down on the table next to the notepad and looked over his work. With his mind free, the sound of the radiator returned. Dr. Lazare came back into the room. This time, he did not sit in the chair, but rather stood next to the bed, looming.
Let's see how you did.
The doctor said, once more laying the sheet that contained the diagrams on the table next to the notepad. The man looked at the diagrams on the paper and then looked at what he had drawn on the notepad. He looked back and forth from one to the other several times. But these aren't the same diagrams you asked me to recreate, the man said, angling his line of sight upward to better see the doctor's face, which now appeared distorted, disproportionate somehow. You switched out the first piece of paper with another.
I'm afraid that's not true.
The expression on his face was difficult to make out. He crossed his arms over the clipboard, holding it close against his chest. You've tricked me, the man said, looking back to the diagrams, tapping his finger against the doctor's paper. These aren't the same.
Most peculiar,
the doctor said. He scratched a few notes on his clipboard.
Well, there's nothing to worry about. You're merely exhibiting the symptoms of your illness.
My illness? The man said.
Your illness,
the doctor repeated.
I know that your recovery has been difficult for you, but I assure you that we are making progress. I'd like you to continue listening to the diagnostic recording.
He gestured to a tape recorder on the end table beside the man's bed, both of which the man had failed to notice earlier.
Take notes on anything that takes your attention, anything at all. And we will discuss your notes during our next meeting.
After the doctor left, the man lay in his bed and continued listening to the radiator rattle, the steady beeping of the monitor, the beating of his heart. He tried to move the fingers on his left hand. He wondered what kind of illness he had, whether or not it was serious, how long he had been here, and who had brought him here. He wondered when he might leave, where he might go. He wondered who he was, and in this, he felt eerily adrift. Eventually, he picked up the recorder on the end table. The man pressed play and started listening where he could only assume he'd previously left off.
Without recovery, the severity of the patient's suffering is likely to increase until it becomes unbearable. A patient with an illness whose suffering becomes unbearable will find relief only in death. Only the recovery process can prevent the death of the patient.
Later that day, or perhaps even early the next day, an orderly, dressed all in white, white shoes, white pants, white shirt, entered the man's room. His head was shaved and gleaming. Using a small key attached to a ring full of other keys, the orderly unlocked the man's handcuffs, removed them from the bed rail, and then slid them around the armrest of a nearby wheelchair, tightening the single strand with a metallic ratcheting sound. After the orderly helped the man out of his bed and into the wheelchair, he reattached the plastic sensor to the end of the man's left index finger.
"You have a visitor, Lucky Duck,"
the orderly said, rolling the monitor with one hand and guiding the chair with the other.
"She's waiting for you in the courtyard."
The orderly's white shoes were silent on the tile floor, the movement of the chair smooth, everything in motion. Caged light bulbs hung from the arched hallway ceiling, passing in a procession. They entered a large room where a television set blared empty, indiscernible noise. A few people in plain white clothes, robes, and paper gowns milled about aimlessly. Everyone's heads were shaved and gleaming. Then the shrill sound of an electric buzzer hung stubborn in the air. A set of double doors opened as they approached, and a rush of daylight overwhelmed the man's senses. He shielded his eyes with his good hand and saw the light through the webbed skin of his fingers. Everywhere, still he heard the sound of the electric buzzer. He closed his eyes and saw black spots, negative impressions of the sun, drifting. His chair came to a sudden halt, and the man felt the orderly set the foot brakes. He opened his eyes. The sky was limitless, the air clean. In the distance, he saw a mountain range, chunks of dark stone dusted white. The rest of the scene soon fell into place. A placid black water pond, stone walkways, wide lawns. He saw women and children dressed in their finest clothes. He saw couples walking hand in hand, sitting on benches, feeding ducks in the pond. He heard the sounds of laughter, murmurs of distant conversation.
"Malcolm?"
It was a woman's voice, echoing as if through a long tunnel. He heard it again, more insistent this time.
"Malcolm, can you hear me?"
There she was, sitting on a park bench beneath the partial shade of an old tree. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and an overcoat. She wore stylish, oversized sunglasses. Her hands were folded in her lap, and the sharp lines of her diamond ring caught the light of the sun. "Are you talking to me?" the man asked, turning to look over his shoulder as if she might be talking to someone behind him. No one else was nearby, Apparently the orderly had elected to give them privacy, sneaking away soundlessly. The monitor softly beeped. He turned to the woman and saw her face change in a manner he couldn't quite understand.
Of course I am.
She said.
Who else would I be talking to?
She paused, expectant.
Malcolm, please, we've come all this way.
We? Next to the woman sat two boys in school uniforms, identical twins. They had the same tousled blonde hair, the same blue eyes, the same small noses and ruddy cheeks. These sudden intrusions of things and people he hadn't previously noticed were surely a symptom of his illness, he thought. He would have to remember to write that down.
Hello, Dad.
The boys said in unison. Malcolm stared at the two boys in silence.
Darling, don't be rude.
The woman said.
Say something to your sons.
My sons, Malcolm repeated. The two boys looked at him, expectant, waiting for their father to speak to them like fathers speak to their sons. He didn't know what fathers said to their sons, so he decided to tell them what he did know. Perhaps, he thought, it would mean more to them than it did to him. My name is Malcolm. I have an illness. I am working on my recovery. Malcolm was unable to discern whether the boys were bored or terrified, the way they looked at one another wide-eyed. He searched the eyes of the boy closest to him, looking for a clue. He saw that the boy's eyes resembled two glass cubes. Looking deeper, he saw that within each of those two cubes stood a bed and a chair facing the bed. He settled back into his wheelchair, thinking about what this might mean. Then he took out the notepad and with his good hand wrote down all the things that took his attention, just as the doctor had instructed. A few moments passed, during which no one spoke. When he finished writing, Malcolm looked around the courtyard. Two of the ducks rose from the black waters of the pond as if levitating, motionless, and then darted off into the sky. He watched the ducks shrink down to the size of black dots, and when he blinked, they disappeared. They had escaped, he thought. They must be the lucky ones.
Darling?
The woman said, her voice thin, nervous, pulling him back from his drifting thoughts.
Have your doctors said anything about your release?
My release?
When you'll be allowed to return home?
Return home, Malcolm repeated. He folded and unfolded these words in his mind, repeating their sound until they seemed to lose their meaning. How long have I been away from home? The woman ever so slightly shook her head.
Darling, I don't...
Her lips were pressed tight together, a crooked white line, and her chin appeared pitted, quaking.
I don't understand.
She started to sob. How long have I been away from home? He said again, insistent this time. Nobody answered him. The woman continued to sob quietly. The two boys had turned away, looking in opposite directions. One rested his chin on his closed fist. The other slouched with arms crossed over his chest. He saw now that they weren't twins at all. Brothers perhaps, but certainly not twins. One of the boys was clearly older than the other, his facial features more pronounced. One of the boys had hair that was darker than the others. Malcolm wrote in his notepad that two things that initially appeared to be the same will sometimes reveal themselves to be different. He wrote that he should not be fooled by deceptive appearances. He tapped the rubber pencil eraser against his lower lip, thinking. Then he continued, if two cubes appear in place of a person's eyes, then the black void must be the space inside that person's head. He remembered what it felt like to drift above the black void. the fear of the gulf between two things, where there was nothing at all. And if there was a place where there was nothing at all, then surely no person could exist there. "I don't believe that you're real," he said calmly to the woman. He looked at the two boys. "All of you, none of you exist." From behind her dark glasses, tears slipped down the woman's face. She didn't say anything as she stood and approached the two boys, gently touching each one on the shoulder, guiding them down the stone walkway until they had disappeared like ducks in the sky. The monitor beeped, signaling that everything was normal and that nothing had changed.
The patient's illness will ultimately define the patient's reality. Symptoms, by definition, are subjective evidence of the illness itself. Additionally, these symptoms may indicate the existence of something hidden, such as a previously undiagnosed illness or a trauma buried in the unconscious.
From then on, Malcolm spent his mornings in bed, listening to the diagnostic recording, his afternoons watching television in the common area, his evenings back in bed correlating his symptoms. He worried that he wasn't making sufficient progress in his recovery. All of the notes he wrote, the handfuls of unmarked white pills he swallowed, and still his recovery seemed as elusive as ever. He worried that he had lost his way. He worried that he was turning in circles. Then one day, the orderly used the key attached to the ring full of other keys to unlock Malcolm's handcuffs, removing them from the bed frame. He fastened the strand around the monitor's rolling rack.
"The doctor would like to see you now,"
he said. When he arrived at the doctor's office, Malcolm asked about the purpose of the monitor and why he must remain attached to it.
It assures us that everything is all right.
The doctor explained from behind his wide desk.
That beeping noise you hear every so often? Well, that tells us that your vital signs, your heartbeat, breathing rate, temperature, and blood pressure, are as they should be. The signal is monitored from a control room. At any given moment, on any given day, each and every patient here with us is accounted for. We must ensure that everything is in its right place, so to speak.
"In its right place," Malcolm repeated. He folded and unfolded these words. Was everything in its right place? Or was everything, objects, people, shadows, placed in such a way that they only appeared to be in their right place? He took note of the things found within the doctor's office, in case something might appear to be out of place, in case he had missed a clue. There was a full-body model of a skeleton propped up in the corner, various academic degrees in glass frames that had been carefully arranged on one wall. On another wall, a laminated poster that explained first aid for cuts and scrapes. Although he wasn't quite sure why, Malcolm decided that this second poster was meaningful.
What else is taking your attention?
The doctor asked. Malcolm explained his concern that he was turning in circles.
It's your paranoia.
The doctor said, writing all of this down.
Perhaps it's worsening as a result of the anxiety you feel regarding the speed of your recovery.
Yes, Malcolm said. It's worsening. The anxiety.
But that's wonderful news,
The doctor said, smiling.
Not that you have anxiety, no, but rather the fact that we've now identified and diagnosed your paranoia signifies that your recovery is on track. After all, acute paranoia is one of your symptoms. Remember?
He gestured to Malcolm's notepad.
See for yourself.
Malcolm opened his notepad and thumbed through the pages until he found what he was looking for. There, in the middle of a page full of other symptoms, he saw the words, I am paranoid. "Did you write this in here?" Malcolm said, turning the notepad so the doctor could see.
No,
The doctor said.
but that you think I did is a good sign. Your accusation correlates your emotions with a thing outside of yourself.
Malcolm watched the doctor's face closely.
My advice for you,
The doctor said.
is to change up your routine. You've become too set in your ways, and it's interfering with your discovery process. Get outside your comfort zone. Do something unexpected.
The next night, still handcuffed to the beeping monitor, Malcolm decided to heed Dr. Lazare's advice and explore the halls beyond his room, to change up his routine. He went wherever his attention guided him. He rode an elevator down to the basement, passed by signs that said, "Do not enter." He went down a hallway lit with dim flickering light where puddles of rust-colored water had formed on the floor. Exposed plumbing snaked along the ceiling. Steam coursed loudly through the pipes, and industrial machines pounded away in unseen rooms. Eventually, Malcolm found a metal door with a placard that said, "Control Room." He tried the door handle, expecting it to be locked, and was surprised when it opened all on its own. The room was dark. The only source of light was a work lamp lying on its side on the floor, as if it had been swept off the nearby desk. An audio monitor, hidden somewhere in the shadows, warbled a stream of static in which he discerned faint weeping sounds. "Hello?" he said. "Is anyone here?" Malcolm shut the door and locked it in case anyone might be following him. Then he carefully made his way to the overturned lamp, picked it up, and put it back on the desk. Angling the light, he saw a large bank of television monitors, all of which had been turned off, the dozen or so screens smooth as black stone. Countless sheets of loose-leaf paper, each one covered with sequences of numbers and codes, were strewn about the floor. A crack of light was visible on the far wall, an open door leading to yet another room. The second door had a sign on it that said "Danger, Power Supply." He pushed through. The pounding of the industrial machines had grown louder. Malcolm found himself standing at the foot of a long hallway. A fluorescent light hung flickering from the ceiling, suspended by a coil of thick wire. More exposed plumbing, the twisting tubes and pipes like so many veins exposed beneath stripped-away skin, covered one wall. Opposite the steam pipes, he saw a wooden desk and an empty chair, not dissimilar from the one in his room, the same wooden chair he had seen reflected in the eyes of his son. The end of the hallway was obscured by shadow. He felt drawn to the darkness. His heart pounded in rhythm with the unseen machines. He remembered what it felt like to drift above the black void, freed of the weight of his flesh, these handcuffs, his illness. Malcolm's progress was halted by a rusted fence that spanned the width of the hallway. He laced the fingers of his good hand through the cold chain link. There was no going past this point. There was no gate, no entranceway, no way to pass through. And besides, beyond this fence, he saw only darkness, endless hallway. He turned around. He saw the body from some distance, wearing the unmistakable uniform of a security guard, slumped forward in the wooden chair behind the desk. The handle of a surgical scalpel protruded from the smile-shaped wound in the body's abdomen. Malcolm maneuvered around the darkly shimmering puddle of blood on the floor, careful not to get any on his white shoes, the wheels of his monitor's rolling rack. Then he leaned forward to get a better look at the guard's face, which was turned sideways in the low light, resting flat on the desk. It was a mess beyond recognition. A series of deep cuts dragged along the jawline, across the hairline, and around the eye socket. His lips had been mutilated. One of the eyeballs had burst. Malcolm slid free the scalpel and put it in his pocket. It might yet prove useful. He closed the door to the dark hallway behind him, muffling the sound of the industrial machines, and returned to the familiar light of the hallway. From there, he easily found his way back, as if led by an invisible hand.
The primary danger of self-diagnosis stems from a lack of objectivity. If the patient self-diagnoses as nyctophobic, for instance, they will then justify any decision made to avoid darkness as a means of not worsening their illness. Yet an avoidance of this nature does not aid recovery. Perhaps the event of the illness occurred under cover of night?
Malcolm sat on a paper-covered medical exam table, his slipper-covered feet resting on the retractable step. The room was small, brightly lit. Several glass jars lined the counter along the wall, each containing an unrecognizable mass of flesh suspended in green-tinged liquid. The steel sink was spattered with dried blood, and the walls were littered with laminated posters that detailed first aid for cuts and scrapes, all identical to the poster in Dr. Lazare's office. A woman wearing a white lab coat entered the room. "Good afternoon," she said, heading straight for the sink. "Are you ready to have your bandages removed?" The doctor washed her slender hands, seemingly undisturbed by the bloodstains in the sink. When she was finished, she retrieved a pair of scissors with a ribbon handle from one of the cupboards. She asked Malcolm to extend his arm with his palm facing the ceiling. He tried to look in her eyes, to get a glimpse of her hidden self, but she did not meet his gaze, remaining entirely focused on the task at hand. "Seeing a newly healed wound for the first time can be quite unpleasant," she said. "Please be prepared for unwelcome thoughts." Cradling Malcolm's hand in hers, she snipped through the bandages from his wrist to his elbow. The severed strips fell away, revealing a network of jagged incisions neatly stitched together with dark thread. With his good hand, Malcolm traced the scabrous tissue with the tips of his fingers. He felt nothing. "Now we need to remove your stitches," the doctor said. "You may feel some slight discomfort." Using tweezers, she gently plucked at the thread, sliding the sutures up and out of the skin, and snipped each knot with the scissors. When she was finished, she cleaned the wounds with a cotton ball soaked in cool rubbing alcohol. "All done," she said. "Can you wiggle your fingers for me?" Malcolm tried to do as she asked, but his fingers did not respond. "Close your eyes," the doctor said. "I'm going to touch the tip of each finger in no particular order. Please tell me if you feel anything." She paused. "What about now?" "No." "And now?" "Nothing." Malcolm opened his eyes, felt the world spin away from all he had known. The posters on the walls were gone, and the walls themselves had been replaced by unadorned concrete. A small barred window near the ceiling let in slanting beams of cold blue light. He turned once more to the glass jars, seeing now that the largest contained a pair of eyeballs. The next largest held what appeared to be a severed hand, and the largest contained a human heart. Malcolm studied the doctor. "Who are you?" he said. "Where am I?" Ignoring his questions, the doctor pried open Malcolm's eyelid with her thumb and forefinger, shined a small flashlight into one eye, then the other, blinding him. When the light clicked off, Malcolm saw black suns drifting. The black suns dragged darkness over the walls, and the darkness was like an infection spreading through the room. A jagged fissure ripped through the concrete wall, a cracking noise as loud as thunder, beginning near the floor and then extending like the branches of a tree. He tried to stand, to flee the expanding dark, but he was stuck in place. He was strapped to an emergency restraint chair. The straps bit into his shoulders, his forehead. Another strap spanned his lap. His wrists were strapped to the armrests, his ankles to the chair legs. "Tell me," the doctor said, "what do you think happened to your arm?" He recalled only the black void. "I don't know." "Think, Malcolm." He felt himself drifting once more, weightless. "I can't." "For the sake of your recovery," she said, raising her voice, "it's important that you remember. Can you recall anything about the day you woke handcuffed to your bed?" He closed his eyes and let the black void swallow everything outside himself. Joining with the spreading infection of the room, the drifting black suns ringed with light. A single still image took his attention, unfinished and dark around the edges, like a great room lit by crooked fingers of lightning. He saw himself sitting behind Dr. Lazare's wide desk, in the room with the model skeleton propped up in the corner, its hollow eyes gaping. More images followed, only these were not merely still, but moving, vivid with sound and color. He saw wide-eyed patients dressed in white, disappearing behind locked doors, dragged, kicking and screaming through the tunnels deep beneath the building. He saw men and women strapped to gurneys wheeled down darkened hallways. He saw bone saws and large-gauge needles held up under blinding lights. The mouth of a furnace lit up like an inferno. And then he saw a security guard roaming the empty halls, making his rounds, stopping at each door, each individual cell, to peer through the viewing pane. Malcolm took in all of these sights and more as he watched the wall of closed-circuit TVs in the control room. He wore a white lab coat and expensive pants. He twirled a retractable pen in one hand, nervously clicking its button. On one of the screens, he saw the security guard descending the steps into the basement, sweeping the beam of his flashlight across the hall. In a fit of rage, Malcolm swept the contents of the desk onto the floor. The reams of paper that contained readouts of each patient's vitals, the small radio that piped in sound from the nearby operating theater, and the light of the work lamp angled toward the ceiling. He turned off the TVs, plunging the room into darkness. He stalked through the shadows, coming up behind the security guard and plunging the scalpel into his side. He watched himself slashing frantically at the security guard's hands and fingers as he attempted to protect himself. And then he was back in his room, in his office, pacing back and forth, his hands pressed to the sides of his head. Another flash of lightning lit up his office in electric blue. The life he had built himself, the knowledge he had accrued, the accomplishments and laurels that stacked like cadavers, all of it would soon be gone. He'd gotten careless. He'd been found out. There was only one thing left to do. He sat down, opened a drawer in his desk, and removed yet another surgical scalpel. Then he took off his lab coat, rolled up his sleeve, laid his arm flat on the surface of his desk, and with his good hand, his operating hand, pressed the cold blade against his flesh. He held his hand against the wound, tried to hold it all in, but it forced its way through the spaces between his fingers, escaping him. He felt dizzy, his vision fading, lights drifting. Always, he felt like he was drifting. Malcolm opened his eyes. The doctor stood before him, watching him, taking notes. "Tell me, Malcolm," she said. "Tell me what happened. Tell me what you saw." The whole room trembled, as if it might collapse. He tried to read the doctor's face, to get a sense of what she was thinking, but her features had gone smooth. A single continuous surface. She could be anybody at all. And if that were true, then nobody was anybody. "I can't be who I think I am," he said. "It's just a symptom of my illness." The cracks in the wall ripped open. Great slabs of black stone crushed the light out of the room. In the newly hatched darkness, Malcolm drifted, rushing toward the limitless black beyond. Wind whipped at his face, the rush of sound all-consuming. He opened his eyes.
If the state or quality of the patient's reality is fractured, if the subjective reality is wholly isolated from an objective context, then, with no other recourse, the patient will unerringly search out that which best mirrors what is real. Malcolm, if you're listening to this, if you've made it this far, then surely you realize these words are intended to release you from the grip of your illness, to relieve you of your suffering. Surely you realize that these words were recorded only for you, by you. You're in the final stages of your recovery. As such, you must be careful when making your diagnosis. Think of all the evidence. Remember what it means to be a person with a name and a family, with memories and feelings and the freedom to live a life of your own choosing. Do not give in.
The man who was Malcolm stood in the center of the room and turned in a circle. When he came to a stop, he saw a bed and a chair facing the bed, just like before. Still, he was unsure if this was his room or if it was merely meant to resemble his room. Things emerged from nothingness all on their own. He saw that now. He saw a steam radiator in the corner, a wheelchair beside the bed. He saw his monitor on its rolling rack, its constant green light, the silver gleam of the handcuffs, the plastic sensor clipped to the end of his finger. He searched out anything that was not in its right place, and one thing took his attention immediately. Where once there had been a wire-reinforced window, there was now a full-length mirror. He studied his reflection in the mirror, a faceless man in a white hospital gown. He remembered something he had once written down. Two things that initially appear to be the same sometimes reveal themselves as different. Likewise, two things that appear to be different can reveal themselves to be one and the same. There was nothing. He was nowhere, drifting. And only in his awareness of this nothingness did something emerge. Where he should have seen the man who was Malcolm, he instead saw a body with its secrets exposed to the world. A skeleton poorly disguised in a suit of skin. His skin hid who he really was. It was his skin that buried the root of his illness. He must emerge from beneath the deceptive surface once and for all. Malcolm pressed the blade of the scalpel against his forehead, just below his hairline, felt the cool metal come up against bone. There was no pain. He felt nothing. He pulled a line down the outer edge of his face, the blade gliding cleanly along his ear, below his chin. He made an identical incision on the other side of his face. Then he traced a circle around one eye, the other eye, drawing so much blood he could no longer see. He worked without aid of sight, snuck his fingers deep beneath the lip of skin at the top of his forehead, and began to slowly peel away the featureless mask, the deceptive thing that hid his true self. The sticking skin was stubborn, his fingers slipping, but he remained intent. He prepared himself for unwelcome thoughts. There was blood everywhere. His hospital gown was completely soaked through, clinging to every contour of his body like a second skin. A sudden shudder of dizziness sapped the strength of his legs, his knees gone rubbery. The monitor released a frantic, high-pitched whistle, the unmistakable alarm of fading vital signs. He meant to silence the machines somehow, in case they came running for him, in case they tried to save him, but instead slipped in the puddle of his own blood. The weight of his bones pulled down his body, pulled down the monitor. He dropped the blade, heard it clatter against the floor, and fell hard on his hip. With a final effort, he ripped free the clinging mask, which now flapped loose and rubbery over his mouth. He was free. His vision returned, and with it, the light of the room. He saw everything as it truly was, the sunken world beyond the blinding illness. The light was everywhere all at once, and as he pulled away, it became smaller, smaller still, until it split into two gleaming glass cubes. He saw them there, as if from above, felt himself drifting away into depthless space, finally and wholly free of the fear of losing himself.
Thank you for listening to Horror Tales. My name is Max Ablitzer and I'm a music composer. To commission an original score or sound design for your own project, you can get in touch with me over at horrortalespodcast.com. That is horrortalespodcast.com. A special thank you to David Peake for contributing the story The Final Diagnosis of Dr. Lazare. You can learn more about David Peake and his work on his website at davidpeake.blogspot.com. That is David, Peak.blogspot.com. And also a huge thank you to Joe Juvland for narrating this story. You can visit Joe on his website at www.joejuvland.com. That is Joe, Juvland.com. And another big thank you to Paul Fowles, who performed Dr. Lazare, and Alison Latondres, who performed his wife. I hope you enjoyed listening, and let's meet again in the next episode of Horror Tales.